Welcome back. This is a sermon for the 19th Sunday of Pentecost. The text I'm using is a poem by Joy Harjo, Once the World Was Perfect, in Matthew 21:33 through 46. Now, I want to begin with a gospel story smell test. And that is with Jesus, a first century Galilean peasant, a defiant and subversive preacher, later executed by the Romans for insurrection, create a parable in which an absentee landlord is the metaphor for a just and compassionate God, while tenant farmers serve as a metaphor for the evil bad guys. No. It has our buddy Matthew written all over it, pun intended. Besides, it's more of an allegory than a parable, and that's another clue for us that whatever nub of a Jesus teaching is here, it's wrapped in Matthew's editing from a great distance in years, historic events, and evolved theology. So let's just skip to the punchline of Matthew's parable, where he writes, "Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard out to other tenants who will give him the produce at harvest time." We see that Matthew's God does not require mere punishment for failure, but rather execution. Not only execution, but a miserable death. Why so much vengeance? Matthew's virulence was more about Caesar than God. Here's what I mean. Early Christian writers took the vineyard metaphor found in Isaiah and also in Psalm 80 and fashioned it into a weapon against their Jewish contemporaries. Now remember, we're not talking about Jesus in Jesus' day and John the Baptist in the struggle with the temple clergy. This gospel was written at least half a century later. Think about the differences between 1970 and now. But while Matthew edits Jesus' original parable into this allegory, both John the Baptist and Jesus are dead and gone. There had been a war in Judah and Galilee in which the temple was destroyed and the Roman scorched earth campaign killed most Jews and Jewish Christians or sent them, the survivors, fleeing to other parts of the empire. Matthew's nasty God and evil tenants represent a fledgling Jesus movement fighting for the last seat on the lifeboat. Here's what I mean. Those early Jesus followers were competing for a unique legal status awarded to Jews under Roman law. You see, it goes back to Julius Caesar, the first Roman emperor, who had granted Jewish communities very special privileges. Only Jews, for example, among all the other conquered peoples, had the legal right to assemble, had the legal right to keep property, and both govern and tax themselves. That's amazing. But they were also allowed to enforce their own rules in order to keep Torah. And especially coveted, they were also given exemption from military service and from emperor worship. So think about this. Jews were the only non-Roman religion to have those kinds of rights and privileges. All non-Roman religions other than Judaism were forbidden even from entry into Rome, the city of Rome. Even after the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70, Jews continued to be protected under that special status granted by the long-dead Julius Caesar, but obviously their perch had become a bit more precarious. Jews made it known to the Romans that the followers of Jesus were not Jews, even though their earliest Jesus followers all had been Jewish. Christians, of course, saw themselves as inheritors of God's covenant with Israel. Talk about a partisan divide. The fledgling churches, many founded by Paul, became more and more Gentile, and so they had to argue for a legal status in the Roman Empire. They were the inheritors of God's covenant with Israel, they insisted. They were not a new religion. They said they were a new Israel, and so therefore should be exempted. Now that parable we just heard is a very early Christian legal argument against Judaism and in favor of Christians gaining the rights and the privileges afforded to Jews under Roman law. It was desperately important that they achieve such legal status because, like Jews, Christians could not worship the emperor, nor could they serve in the military. So this legal argument between Christians and Jews in the court of Roman opinion was not some abstract theological claim. The question of whose covenant it was, Jews or Jesus-following Gentiles, was a struggle for survival that came down to life or death. Basically, the case the early Christians were making with the parable and other such gospel rhetoric was that God had rejected the Jews because they didn't recognize Jesus. Therefore, God was giving the covenant to Christians. The covenant between God and Israel, the one that went back to Abram and Sarah and Moses and Joshua, was now an exclusive franchise that only the followers of Jesus owned. And that was their argument. But it was a poor argument, unsubstantiated by the facts, and rejected by most of the emperors until Constantine. And so it was often tough going for Christians in those first 300 years, creating much bitterness and enmity then between Judaism and Christianity. And then Christianity became the religion of the empire and used its status and power to wreak vengeance on Jews for centuries and centuries following. The church sullied Jesus as the Lord of genocide over and over and over again. And the parable we read today from Matthew was and continues to be misused for that purpose. That's the history lesson. Now, Joy Harjo gives us a whisper of a changing spiritual practice to point us forward. She writes, and this is an excerpt, "Then one of the stumbling ones took pity on another and shared a blanket. A spark of kindness made a light. The light made an opening in the darkness. Everyone worked together to make a ladder. The Wind Clan person climbed out first into the next world, and then the other clans, the children of those clans, their children, and their children, all the way through time to now, and to this morning light to you." Again, an excerpt from Once the World Was Perfect by Joy Harjo. Well, I don't know who the Wind Clan was or is, but I do know we know how to do what they did to bring a spark of light to the darkness that is all around. A spark of light to help us find the ladder to climb back up to the next world. Or as Jesus said, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Today is a perfect day to note why we here at Trinity Place add a contemporary reading, mostly poems, to the ancient texts we have from Scripture. We need them to play off each other, to remind us that the Bible is not a perfect filter that can be picked up and applied as to life as we live it without inspection or analysis and thoughtful critique. While much of Christianity today still holds the Bible is perfect and completely factual in its every word, the Episcopal Church does not believe that. We hold that Scripture has to be mediated to reveal the holy. Scripture must have with it both tradition, that history of the many commentaries and interpretations throughout history, along with our contemporary experience for it to unveil the sacred within it. In short, Scripture must be unpacked and rattled and shaken and held to the light of the moment in order to reveal what is inside of it. Otherwise, we get genocide and hatred and vengeance and violence and bigotry and just plain ignorance. Here's what we know today that we didn't know in Matthew's day, or Isaiah's for that matter. The cosmos is still expanding from that first Big Bang. That moment of ignition when the Creator of all that is lit a spark of kindness that made light. That was nearly 14 billion years ago, a number only God could truly contemplate. And our little solar system came along just a measly 4.5 billion years ago. And our people, the current versions of what we call Homo sapiens, well, we've only been around for 160,000 years or so. But we've also know how this story ends. The sun gets hotter and hotter and eventually swallows the earth whole. We'll be gone. It is not at all a perfect world from the human perspective. There's no Garden of Eden from which we came and to which we will be returned. Those are myths told to explain other things like where evil came from if God is so loving. But if we look at those images from the James Webb telescope, it isn't difficult for us to imagine it is a perfect universe, and we are somehow part of that perfection, even with all of our imperfections. We can look at the Alps or the Adirondacks, Big Sur or Seneca Lake, blueberries, daylilies, and Queen Anne's lace, and see for ourselves the magnificence and the perfection of the creation if we're not looking at it from human eyes that only worry about our own fate. And if we wish to create a better world and to practice a better spiritual wisdom or even nurture a more perfect spiritual community, then that is what we must do. We must see beyond our own self-interests, hold compassion for ones who stumble, and share a blanket or whatever they need. That's how a spark of kindness makes a light so we can climb up through an opening in the darkness together. You see, we have somehow just traveled from Matthew's day in 85 CE back to the Big Bang some 14 billion years ago, and then to Trinity Place on Castle Street in 2023. We be the Wind Clan, sharing a blanket with one who stumbles, whether someone here that we know or someone out there we don't know. We be the ones sparking a light from kindness and making an opening in the darkness so that we can climb together into the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. That's our spiritual practice, sparking light, one act of kindness at a time. Thank you, and peace be with you. That was beautiful, Lisa.